every so often, we take little pauses in like the regularly scheduled program. We've been walking through the Synoptic Gospels on our Wednesday night Bible study for like almost 2 years now. But every so often, we just pause for a month and we focus on a particular theme. And like in December, we'll pause and we'll focus on Christmas, and we'll spend the whole month just talking about Christmas and how the Lord became flesh and all of these various things. And during Easter time, we'll stop and we'll take a whole month talking about Easter and the resurrection and all of the glorious things that are found therein. But we also talk about other things. For instance, we stop in the month of June and we talk about issues of sexuality. We talk about homosexuality, transgenderism, sexual ethics in general. Of course, because June is Pride Month. So we stop and we talk about those things. Well, October, this month, this year, has been another one of those pauses in our regularly scheduled program. We've been talking about politics. We've been talking about the upcoming election. Because, of course, early in November is an election. And so what we want to do is be a people who are equipped to go into the voting booth and to make solid, informed decisions from a biblical worldview, trying to bring God glory in the way that we vote. That's kind of the goal. So over the course of this month, we've been focused on these various things. And on Sunday mornings, we've been looking at Romans 13, where we have talked about who instituted government. We talked about what is the government's responsibility to the citizens, to the country, and we've talked about what is our responsibility as citizens to the government and to society. On Wednesday nights, we've been looking from God's law, the books of Moses, particularly Deuteronomy and Leviticus, even a little bit in Exodus, and we've been asking the question, what does God say about the particular issues that we are facing in this upcoming election? So we've talked about immigration and borders and migrants. We've talked about, what did we talk about last time? Law and justice, right? What are God's standards for justice and how to execute legal system type things? We also did just a basic refresher on American civics. Well, tonight, we are going to be getting into the third issue. This will actually be our final Bible study on Wednesday night pertaining to the election, and that is going to be the issue of life. So tonight we're going to talk about abortion, we're going to talk about the death penalty, we're going to talk about some principles from the Word of God concerning life and death, which is obviously one of the most pressing political issues we have. But what I was getting at earlier, I was telling somebody, I'm so ready to be done with talking about all this stuff. I don't think, maybe you're ready to be done talking about it too. But here's the thing. Some of these things, when we pause, they're like encouraging, they're uplifting. When we're talking about the resurrection, like at the end of the month, I'm just built up and strengthened and encouraged. But some of the things we talk about are the opposite. You get to the end of the month and you're just like drained and exhausted. Because these, like the issue of Pride Month and this, my experience here has been, these things are just draining. I'm tired of thinking about it. I'm tired of talking about it. It's not really spiritually enriching to spend so much time focusing on these things. So as we approach the end of the month, I'm telling you, I'm happy to be approaching the end of the month. Next week is the 30th. And next week, Lord willing, what I want to do is talk about the history of Halloween. So we do that from time to time. We look at our histories. We haven't done Halloween yet. Let's talk about Halloween next week. That's the goal. But tonight, this is a very important issue, so we are going to tackle it. We're going to do the same way that we have been doing it. We're going to look at first principles. We're going to take principles that we can pull out of the Word of God, and then we're just going to try to make application of those principles. So tonight, I've got 4 that I want us to look at. One is that all human beings are made in the image of God. Very simple stuff. This is like Genesis 1 stuff. All human beings are made in God's image. The second one I want to look at is that God considers unborn people to be fully human and protected by His law. God considers unborn people to be human beings, and there are protections for the unborn in the law of God. The third principle I want to look at is that God instituted the death penalty. Just like He instituted government, God instituted the death penalty. And the fourth thing we're going to look at is that God prescribes the death penalty in His law. So these are our 4 principles that we're going to look at, and we're going to begin to make application. Any questions about that before we move into them? Well, let's open up together to Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning. Back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 1, the very first book in the Bible.
It's page 1.
Yeah, page 1. If there's any questions. Actually, in my Bible, I think it's like page 4. Yeah, it's page 4 for me, so don't be misled by me here.
Mine didn't bother to remember the table of contents.
Yeah, I think I got an introduction is what is making the difference there. Okay, so yeah, Genesis chapter 1, and we're going to read verses 26 and 27. So if somebody, when we get there to Genesis chapter 1, let's read verses 26 and 27.
And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and all over the earth, and over every over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So that God created man in his own image. In the image of God created him, him male and female created he them.
Okay, very good. So this is our passage. Now this is actually one of the most important couple of verses in the whole Bible, I believe, because what we see from these 2 verses is that human beings are unique. Among all of the things that were created, human beings are unique. What is it that makes human beings unique? Made in the image of God. He doesn't say that about the fish, nor the birds, nor the goats, or the cattle, or the creeping bugs on the earth. Only human beings, he says, are made in God's image and in his likeness. And this idea that human beings are made in the image of God, this is what gives human beings their inherent value and dignity. Sometimes people ask the question, why do we eat like pigs? Why do we eat cattle? So a lot of people who are vegetarians, they'll say, well, I just don't think it's right to kill and eat another animal because it's a living thing, and so why should I kill a living thing to eat it? Why am I elevating my importance as a human above that of a pig, above that of a cow, above that of whatever you might kill and eat? And there actually is an answer to that question. The answer to that question is because pigs were not made in God's image. Cows were not made in God's image. Human beings were made in the image of God. Therefore, human beings are more valuable than those animals. Human life, go ahead.
You have a soul.
Yeah, humans have a soul, a rational soul, nonetheless, one that is able to understand and experience God. And that is one of the aspects of being made in his image. It separates humans from animals. It separates humans from plants. It separates humans from all of the other things that have been created. Human beings are made in God's image. And as I said, this is the source of human value. So it's not a surprise to me when you look, for instance, at the 20th century, and you look at a place like Soviet Russia, you look at a place like the Third Reich, the German Empire or whatever, you look at these 20th century China under Mao, and all of these people had a worldview. And they saw the world in a particular way. And one of the ways they saw the world was that human beings were no different than animals. Human beings were no different than goats or pigs or anything else. And the cause, they had this evolutionary worldview that human beings were just one of many products of evolution, and that ultimately human beings are no more or less valuable than any other thing, than any other form of cattle, if you will. And how did we see those regimes treat human beings? Terribly. They treated them like cattle, right? Human beings are no different than pigs or cows or anything else. And human beings were slaughtered like pigs and cows and everything else in those regimes during that time. Over 100 million people were killed, whether by starvation or by murder or whatever else, in the 20th century under these atheistic regimes that did not view human beings as creatures made in God's image. Does that make sense? So my point is when you take that away, you're taking away human value. When you take away the fact that we're made in God's image, you're taking away the idea of dignity. When you take that key aspect of who we are as human beings, you're really removing what makes humans special. And the same thing is done, I'm going to give a couple more examples. So the same thing was done in the issue of slavery in the American South. Black people were considered less than human. They were considered something other than human. They were considered subhuman, I guess you could say. And for that reason, because they are subhuman, we can enslave them. It's not a big deal. Because they're not human beings. They're property, right? It was the same idea that went into that. And that same idea is carried forward today to the unborn. That same idea is carried forward today in the issue of abortion. We look at babies in the womb and we say, well, that's not a human. That's a fetus. That's not a human. That's a zygote. That's not a human being. That's just a cluster of cells. It's a parasite, XYZ, whatever they say. But when you take the humanity from the unborn, when you say this is not a human being made in God's image, you say it's something other than that, it makes it very easy to then treat it as something other than that. And that makes it very easy to systematically slaughter, right? So these are some of my thoughts. What are some of your thoughts about this?
Well, I worked with a doctor that said they are parasites. The definition of parasites is they take from the mother and don't give anything back until they're born. He said they are parasites by definition.
That was a doctor who said that? Well, I would find a different doctor. 'Cause that's definite.
Ask how many mothers you wanted their children. And you're like, is that a parasite you're carrying? And I bet they will tell you, oh no, I already love this baby.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I'm not a biologist, but I think if we were to look up a definition of parasite, we would find that unborn human beings, unborn young, do not fit that definition. So if I had a doctor who said something like that, I'd find a different doctor. That's me. Any other thoughts? Any questions about this idea of being made in the image of God? He's fine. Don't worry. He's fine. He's not getting anything. He's all right. This is a clean floor, okay? This is a brand new, fresh. You could eat off of this floor, and he will, so don't worry about it. It's all good. Yeah. Yeah, it's all good. Don't worry about it. Yeah, no, that's no problem. So this is our first principle, and this is a very important principle. This is important for us to understand. Human beings created in God's image. This is the source of dignity. This is our source of value. It's found in the fact that we are made in His image, in His likeness. This is only true of human beings. And when we take this and we begin to apply it to the abortion issue, once again, we're not talking about just a cluster of cells in someone's tummy. What we're talking about is a human being. We're talking about the very image of God in unborn form, still developing, right? And that would mean that, it means that you're talking about human beings. I just want to establish that as a first principle so everyone's on the same page. When we talk about abortion, we're talking about killing humans, okay? Let's look at the second principle, and this one's important too. Unborn humans are, in fact, human. Unborn humans have protection in God's law. Let's look at Exodus 21 together. Exodus is just the next book over. We're in the 21st chapter. So now we've officially covered all 5 books of Moses. So now we've hit the whole law. We've done Genesis, Exodus. I don't think we've hit Numbers, actually. So I dropped the ball. We missed it. I don't have anything from Numbers tonight. We're in Exodus chapter 21. And we're going to read from Exodus chapter 21. Let's read verses 22 through 25. And I'm going to ask somebody who does not have the King James Version to read it. Somebody who is not using a King James Version, please read verses 22 through 25.
And if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with child so that she has a miscarriage, yet there is no further injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay as the judges decide. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for bruise, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Okay, very good. What version were you just reading?
New American Standard.
New American Standard. Does anybody else have a different version? Particularly, I want to read verse 22. We don't have to read the whole thing, but let's read verse 22 in a different version. Not King James, not New American Standard.
I've got one.
Go ahead.
Now suppose two people are fighting, and in the process they hurt a pregnant woman, so her child is born prematurely. If no further harm results, then the person responsible must pay damages in the amount of the woman's husband demands and the judges approve.
Okay, very good. Did everybody catch the difference between those two versions? I'll read the King James Version. If men strive and they hurt a woman with child so that her fruit departs from her, and yet no mischief follows, he shall surely be punished, according to the woman's husband's will lay upon him. According as the woman's husband will lay upon him, he shall pay as the judges determine. So there's 3 different versions of this verse, and all 3 versions say something different. They say something different. What the King James Version is probably the least clear. That's why I didn't want to start with it. Because it says if she's with child and her fruit departs from her. And when you read that, when I just reading that, I think like the fruit dies. The fruit departs, like it goes into the next world, right? And that seems to be the way it was understood in the New American, because it said, if the woman has a miscarriage. And then in the one that Sister Lois read, it said, if the baby is born prematurely, which is different than both of those things, right? And so sometimes in English translations, things aren't always super clear. So what do we do when the English translation is not super clear? What do we need to consult? We need to consult the original language. In this case, that would be Hebrew. Go ahead.
Mine does have a footnote where instead of miscarriage, it says her children come out.
Her children come out. Yeah, so that would be like a premature birth. And so, as we can see, there is room for confusion on here. And so what we need to do when there's confusion in the English translation is we need to always go back to the original languages, and maybe that will help clear things up for us. Now, the word that is translated in the King James as depart, I don't know what the Hebrew word itself is, but it's a word that means to come forth. It's a word that means basically to be born. It's a word that means to come out. And it gives the idea of the baby being delivered. So this passage is giving us the idea of 2 men are fighting, and the wife comes and tries to break it up or something, and then the wife ends up getting hit in the stomach or something, and she gives birth to the baby. And what the passage is telling us as we keep going through, and I think this makes more sense just looking at the context of the passage. It says if men strive, if they're fighting, and they hurt a woman who's with child, so that she brings forth her child, premature birth, and mischief follows, that is to say, there's something wrong with the baby. Maybe the baby's dead. Maybe the baby's deformed. Maybe the baby is blind. Something happened to this baby which appears to be the result of the injury to the mother. Or in this case, it's saying that didn't happen. He says if no misfortune happens, then it's not a problem. If there is no mischief, then he's fine. Everything is good. However, if something happens to the baby, if the baby is born prematurely as being dead, if it causes a miscarriage, if you kill the baby in the womb, and then the woman brings forth a dead baby, the one who killed the baby is to be put to death. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. If the baby was brought forth and it was blind, eye for eye. If the baby is brought forward and its arm is mutilated in some way, hand for hand. This is the passage. Let's read it again and let's see what it's saying. If two men fight and they hurt a woman who is pregnant so that she delivers the baby prematurely, and yet no mischief follows, nothing's wrong with the baby, he will be punished according to how the husband wants to punish him, and as the judges determine. So he will be punished, but just in a certain way. Verse 23, if any mischief follow, dead, deformed, blind, whatever, then you will give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So what we see happening in this passage is this is one of God's laws basically providing protection to unborn children. If you hit a pregnant woman and kill her baby, you're going to die. Why? Because you killed the baby. It's life for life. It's eye for eye. It's tooth for tooth. And that's what we see enshrined in the law. Any questions or thoughts or comments about that?
We used to have all U.S. states, well, I guess they're still there, but they're kind of screwed down because, of abortion.
Yeah.
Because if you hurt a lady that she had a miscarriage, you're responsible for that.
Yeah.
Life.
Yeah. For instance, if you're drunk driving and you crash into a pregnant lady and you kill her baby, but not her, you can still be charged for homicide.
If you kill them both, you can be charged with double.
Right. And so even in our laws, there are some situations where we treat the unborn as human beings, and there are others, obviously, where we don't. That's an inconsistency. That's an unequal weight and measure, like we talked about last week. There's a problem with that, right? Any other thoughts or ideas concerning this?
My mind always thinks different. It's like, how much responsibility does the woman have for jumping in the middle? And how about if it was her and her husband's fault? And the other guy was trying to defend himself. And also, how long do you have to wait to find out if there's any mischief on the baby? Sometimes you can't see the problems right away. I don't know why, but
That's true. And that's a good point, because none of this is not like tribal warfare type stuff, you know what I mean? Look at the end of what verse 22, he says the punishment will be according as the judges determine. So there is a legal system in place, there is a governmental intervention here, there is judges who are presiding over this issue. It's not like the husband just gets to kill the dude and that's it, you know what I mean? There is a system of justice that is established for questions like that to be answered. There's another little example in the case law found in Moses where two men are fighting and the woman runs into the middle of the fight and grabs the man by the testicles, and then it says that for that woman you are to cut her hand off. That is the penalty prescribed to the woman for doing that, is she loses her hand for that kind of an action. So I think that's right. You might have to double check me, but if I remember correctly, that's how that all goes. So that's an incentive not to get involved. And ladies, let me just give you a piece of advice. If you see two men fighting, just stay away from them. Don't try to interfere. Don't get in the middle of it. Just let them fight, okay? If he's about to kill him or something, maybe you need to do something to interfere. But if two guys are fighting, just let them fight. You're going to get yourself hurt if you get in the middle of it. So just stay out of it. Let them fight. It's going to be okay, usually, most of the time, okay? Don't get involved in that kind of thing. You don't want to get hurt. You don't want to lose your hand, okay? That's all I'm saying. If you don't want to lose your hand, just stay out of it, all right? All kidding aside, but so that question is addressed. There's questions there too, like, are you supposed to jump in? How are we supposed to deal with these kind of conflicts? But in this case, we're talking about a pregnant woman who loses her baby. And the penalty there, if she loses the baby, is whoever killed the baby is going to get put to death. Which that really leads us right into the next point very well. The next thing, we're talking about abortion and we're talking about the death penalty is the other thing we want to talk about. And that leads me to the next point, which is that God is the one who instituted the death penalty. We just saw an example of it, but let's go back to Genesis again. Let's go to Genesis chapter 8 together. We saw earlier in Genesis that human beings are created in God's image and God's likeness. This is the reason why unborn humans have value. This is the reason why unborn humans have dignity, why we should be concerned about preserving their lives, because they are, in fact, human beings made in God's image. And the whole entire point of God's law is to preserve life. To preserve life, to love man, to love God, to love your neighbor, and to preserve life. We've also seen that even in God's law, he talks about this issue of the unborn. And if the unborn are harmed, then the penalty is the same as if a fully grown, developed human was harmed. If you kill a human, the penalty is death. If you kill an unborn baby, the penalty was also death. And that leads us very sweetly into our next point, which is that God is the one who instituted the death penalty. This was an idea that came from him. So let's read from Genesis chapter 8. I think I said 9. But it's it is 9. 3 through 6. Chapter 9, verses 3 through 6.
Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herb. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. For the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man.
In verse 6.
Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For the image of God he made man.
He says, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood will be shed. For in the image of God made he man. The death penalty is the result of the fact that human beings are made in God's image. It is the foundation of the penalty of death for death. It's because we are made in God's image, which is quite fascinating. Just to give you the context of this passage, this is after God flooded the world. This is after the ark. This is after Noah with his sons and their wives got on the boat. Now they're getting off of the boat. And Noah has sacrificed to God, and God is coming now and making his covenant with Noah, telling him, I will never flood the earth. Here's the rainbow in the sky to prove this. And God here is the one who is speaking in the verse we just read, and he is telling these things to Noah. And it's interesting to note that when God spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden, he said, I have given you every tree and every herb to be your food. You can eat all the herbs of the earth. You can eat all the fruit of the various trees. That's what is your food. And it's not until Noah where God says, I've given you the herbs of the field, I've given you the fruit of the tree, but I've also given you the meat of all of the animals. That was later. God never said that to Adam and Eve, which I find to be quite interesting. Because remember, in the Garden of Eden, there was no death. It wasn't until sin entered the picture that death entered the picture. So how are human beings going to eat animals if we can't kill the animal to eat the meat? Because there was no death prior to sin. Now this is after sin. This is after all of the things that happened. And God is telling them this is like a restart for humanity. And he's saying, I've given you the meat of all the animals to eat as well. He also says in this passage, the fear of you and the dread of you will be upon all the wild animals. You ever notice how wild animals don't like humans very much? It kind of all comes back to this. Wild animals are instinctually afraid of humans because humans kill them and eat them, right? But this was said even all the way back here in Genesis chapter 9. But look at what he says. Focus in for a minute on the end of verse 5 and verse 6. He says, at the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. He says, I will require blood for every beast that is slain. We're going to give an account for all the animals we kill. We're going to give an account for all of the blood that we spill on the earth. That's an interesting thing to think about. But he says, at the hand of every man's brother, I will require the life of a man. Anyone who sheds a man's blood, by man his blood will be shed, for he was made in God's image. And this really is the institution of capital punishment. This is the institution of the death penalty. Humanity's fresh start, the first government with those people, Noah and all of his family, he is setting down a principle. Anyone who kills another man is going to be put to death. Any questions or thoughts or comments on that?
How come they won't let us do it more? Well, I'm sorry, but I mean for the real sick ones.
Well, okay, so that's a good question. We live in a society. We have a government. We have the death penalty in many places in our society. And it seems, though, that the death penalty is not carried out very often. And when it is, it's carried out in a very funny way. Oftentimes people are convicted, sentenced to death, and then they'll stay on death row for a really long time, appealing, doing all kinds of things, and then eventually they are put to death at some certain point, usually at least 10 or more years later. And you can look back through history and we see that was not the case. I mean, think about Jesus. Jesus was sentenced and tried and sentenced and found guilty and condemned as worthy of death and then executed all in the same day. Happened all in one day, right? And you can look at other instances, even in American history, of people exercising the death penalty in a much more rapid fashion. So why is it that we don't see it that way? Well, because there is a big push. We talked about last week the two different views of the purpose of the justice system, where some people view the justice system as being an opportunity for people who have broken the law to repay their debt to society. It's retributive in that fact. And then others look at it as an opportunity to restore criminals back into society. And which one of those ideas is presented in Scripture? The first one, right? The idea of punishment in legal systems is to pay the debt. That's why in the Bible, if a man stole, he didn't go to jail. He paid back what he stole with interest. You know, if a man, there's many laws where if a man did something, he wasn't locked up in a prison cell. He had to work off. If he didn't have the money, he had to sell himself as a slave and work off the debt. And he would be set free on the year of Jubilee. So this is how it works in God's law. But there are many crimes and sins which require the death penalty. And we're going to read about that in a moment. But in our society, for the most part, the people who are in power in many places don't view the legal system as being toward that end, for that purpose. And so, if they're even keeping people in jail, which they don't want to do, if they're even putting people in jail, which they don't want to do, if they're even punishing crime in any capacity at all, which they don't want to do, they're definitely not putting anybody to death, right? And there are many Christians who would say, listen, the death penalty is unjust. It's not good. We shouldn't do it. We should give people an opportunity for mercy and to repent. There's Christians who would say that, and I disagree with that perspective. But here's one thing about the death penalty that I will say. I think there is some percentage, and I don't know what it is, but it's more than a small percentage, of people who are on death row who ultimately are acquitted. And this is not a small percentage. This is like quite a number of people. I want to say even as many as 30%. It might be as much as 30% of people on death row are actually innocent. They're not guilty of the crime they committed. So should we put an innocent person to death?
No, but if they're caught red-handed harming a child, they should be put to death right then, right there, if you ask me.
Okay. And so that is an illustration, but I'll come back to that in just a second. But the thing that I'm saying right now is that in our society, as it stands, some large percentage of people on death row are actually not guilty of their crimes. They could be acquitted. They will be acquitted. And it is a principle in God's law. We talked about this last time. It is better for a guilty person to go free than for an innocent person to be condemned. That is true. It is better for a guilty person to go free than an innocent person to be condemned. Because we all know you might get away with it in this life, you won't get away with it in the next. Judgment will happen ultimately. So it is better for innocent people to not be put to death. Now, I'm like you. If there's a situation where somebody committed a crime worthy of death, and there's no doubt, it's very clear that this person is guilty, they've admitted it, incontrovertible, right? This person has committed a crime worthy of death. My opinion is that the death penalty should be carried out swiftly and publicly. It's like we read one of these passages, I think it was last week, where it says, the other people, they will hear and they will fear and they will not commit that evil. There's a reason why executions used to be public. There's a reason why in God's law it says if you have an unruly child who can't be controlled by the parents, then they should be put to death publicly and the parents should throw the first stone. There's a reason why it says if your wife leads you away to worship false gods, gods that you didn't know, gods that your parents didn't know, then you should put her to death and you should be the one to throw the first stone. There's a reason why those things exist. And that is because these kinds of executions ought to be public, because people will see it and they will hear and they will fear, and it will actually prevent some of these crimes from being carried out in the future, is the
There's
idea.
a reason why there's punishment.
Yeah.
But yet a lot of people don't understand. Sometimes God says this because it will corrupt the society.
Yep.
And when a society gets that corrupt, look what he did to the Amalekites. Go and kill everything, animals and everything. So it's supposed to be as a preventative measure to scare other people, but it's also to protect the society. There's one other kind of deal in there. But that's the reasons why we have those. It's not only just to protect you and your neighbor, but it's the society in whole. Because if you let these people keep on going, that the whole society gets corrupt. And we're starting to see that now because we're getting to that point where a lot of people just won't let everybody out. They're basically that's it. Say that 3 times fast.
Yeah.
They don't believe in law.
Yeah, that's so true. And another thing, I think I want to remind us of this. It's always important to keep in mind when we read about, and we're about to read, the death penalty in Scripture. That does not mean that every single instance of this always got treated with the death penalty. Just like in our legal system, there are sentencing guidelines where you can get 5 to 25 or whatever, 25 to life or whatever. The death penalty is kind of like the high end of the penalty that one can receive for violating these various laws. It doesn't mean that every disobedient, rebellious child was publicly executed, because then there would be like no children, right? All the children would be gone. So this was like an extreme measure that was intended to be carried out publicly, and it's setting an example. It's for the good of the society. It's for the good of the individual being executed, honestly, and it's for the good. It's justice. It's everything. It's good for everybody to do things this way. So, go ahead.
Ark question.
Go ahead.
If the ark was filled with animals 2 by 2, male and female, and Noah either had to be a vegetarian and not kill them, or he only had to kill the males and leave the females, then there wouldn't be any further.
But before the flood, we were not allowed to eat animals. The ark encounter up in Kentucky is amazing. And it showed how you could stock up this huge ship with 100 grains. And it even showed, and it's a recreation, they're like, this is possible, not necessarily biblical, we don't know, but it even had a way for them to be growing a garden on the inside. So,
They probably were vegetarian.
yeah, that was one of the things that God was so mad at the world, because he had said, you will eat vegetables, you will eat the plants. And they were violent in killing each other and the animals were killing each other.
Sacrificial animals, they had separate.
Well, starting in Genesis 8, he was given the rules about, eating animals.
It
So-
didn't happen until after the flood.
Was that after the flood,
It
Genesis
was
8?
after the flood. And one of the theories is the world was drastically changed, because it said he broke open the deep, he broke open the windows of heaven. There was now a totally different ecosystem, and now things changed, we needed the meat for some reason.
And I think the other thing is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if you've been to the Ark exhibit, you might know the chronology a little better than me. They were only on the Ark for like 100 days. You know what I mean? Like you can make it 100 days without meat. So, and there were some animals. It was seven of the animals, and not just 2. So there's some different things
They
going
just
on.
salted it and stocked it up with beforehand.
Yeah.
But she has a good point, though. Did they even eat meat up until that point?
Yeah.
Now, I
That was
heard
one of the
that,
reasons why God declared judgment on all of them.
right, but God killed, and he clothed them with deer skin or animal skin.
Some sort of skin.
So, some people start thinking maybe that's what he allowed.
But like we mentioned before, when God originally spoke to Adam and Eve in the garden, he said, I've given you the herbs, I've given you the fruit, I've given you these things to eat. And it's not until now, speaking to Noah in the Great Reset, if you will, he said, I'm giving you all these things, and I'm giving you the flesh of the animals to eat. And so this is God. God made a covenant with Adam, God made a covenant with Noah, and that's when we see him like green light the eating of flesh. So it is something interesting. The ark is an interesting thing.
Well, that's just like Cain, he killed Abel, but God didn't kill him.
And remember what Cain's concern, what was Cain's biggest fear after he killed Abel and he talked to God? What was Cain afraid of? He was afraid that someone was going to come and kill him. Where did he get that idea? Well, he understood. I think he understood what God said explicitly to Noah. If man sheds blood, his blood will be shed by man. I think that Cain had kind of an understanding of this way that God governs the universe, because his great fear was, I can't go out, you can't get me out of here, because what they're going to do? They're going to kill me. And then he said, I'll put a mark on you. If anyone kills you, they're going to have all kinds of problems. So the Cain understood this concept of capital punishment. He understood, if I kill my brother, I'm going to die, kind of a thing, right?
I was mad enough to kill my brother over this minor thing. How many other brothers and cousins out there really like this guy? They're going to have even more reason to kill me
Yeah, there's that.
or beat me within an inch of my life multiple times.
Yep, there is that. Let's turn together to Leviticus chapter 20. We got a few more minutes here. So far, we've talked about all human beings are made in God's image. God's law makes provision for the unborn, treats the unborn like human beings fully developed. We've seen so far that God instituted the death penalty. And now we're going to look at Leviticus chapter 20, and we're going to see that God prescribes the death penalty in his law. So, again, I just mentioned all month, as we've been looking at these different political issues that we're thinking about in our society, where have we been getting all of our principles from? Was it the Gospel of John? Are we getting all of our principles out of the book of Romans? We're getting it from the Torah. We're getting it from the law. And as believers, this is a big emphasis of mine. I always say this. We don't want to be the type of Christians who say, well, I'm just under grace. The law doesn't mean anything to me. The law doesn't matter. I'm free from the law, so I don't need to understand it. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to study it. It just doesn't matter. We don't want to be those kind of people. We want to be people who seek to understand God's will revealed in his law and learn how we can apply it in our modern day situation in light of Jesus Christ and what he has accomplished, but not forsaking all of the wisdom and virtue that God has given us in his law. The law, after all, is what teaches us what love for God and love for neighbor looks like. Remember what Jesus said, the two greatest commands, love the Lord your God, love your neighbor as yourself. On these, all of the law and the prophets hang. The law and the prophets teach us how to live for God. And so we don't want to just put them aside. We want to read them and consider them and grow from them. I'm just going to read a few passages in Leviticus 20. Let's begin by looking at verse 1. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, again, this is what you will say to the children of Israel. Whosoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that live in Israel, so not only the citizens, but also the immigrants, one law for both of them, whoever are the children or the strangers, any of them that give their seed to Molech, will surely be put to death. The people of the land will stone them with stones. So there was a practice in ancient Canaan where people, they would sacrifice their children to the god of Molech, was it. And I actually heard something really interesting that I'm not going to get into because I don't have time. But basically, this was the result of all of their fornication. It was the result of all their idolatry and all the temple prostitution. So when they have this basically unwanted baby because of their sexually immoral lifestyle, they would just take that baby and sacrifice it to this other god over here. They would just kill the baby, right? And what the Lord is saying here is anyone who does that, whether it be a citizen, an Israeli, or a stranger, an immigrant, if they do this in your land, they're to be put to death, sacrificing children. Look at, it says, anybody who turns their eyes away from this evil, God will set his face against them. It says in verse 6, the soul that goes after familiar spirits, after wizards, to go a-whoring after them, he says, I will set my face against that soul and will cut them off from among his people. And then he goes on, let's find verse 9. Everyone that curses his father or his mother will surely be put to death. He that curses his father or his mother, his blood will be upon him. Any man that commits adultery, verse 10, with another man's wife or his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. The man that lies with his father's wife, his stepmother, or his own mother, both shall surely be put to death. A man that lies with his daughter-in-law, put to death. A man that lies with another man, as with a woman, put to death. A man who takes a wife and her mother, burnt with fire. A man that lies with a beast, an animal, put to death. A woman who lies with a beast, put to death. If a man takes his sister, or any of these other things, cut off from the sight of his people. And there's debate, does that mean they're put to death or are they exiled? I'm not going to get into that right now. But we can just keep going through chapter 20, and you're going to see all of these different laws that require the death penalty. All of these different sins and crimes that are punishable with the death penalty. And we just looked at a few of them. But the point here, once again, is not only did God institute the death penalty, he prescribes the death penalty in his perfect law. So if we're asking the question, does God have a problem with the death penalty? The answer is no. God does not have a problem with the death penalty if it is carried out justly, according to the principles of justice that we talked about last week. Any questions or thoughts about that?
One thing God always looks at too, we forget a lot of times, everybody's eternal. And we look at it as temporary. You take away their life, but you're going on, if you're righteous in God's sight, you're going to heaven. If not, you're going to another place. By cutting that person's life short, then he has no other opportunity to ever be saved and go to heaven. That's the only sad part about it. But I don't look at it, a lot of times, like you told me, you said earlier, it's better to free an innocent man or free a guilty man for the sake of the innocent.
Yeah.
I look at it as an eternal perspective. If the innocent person has to die, I know where he's going to be. So, when you let that bad person go, he can corrupt the society.
The innocent person may not be saved. They may be innocent by the law, but not saved. Which is one reason why I'm not like kill them on the spot if we find them having hurt a child. They're still a human being. They still need due process of law, that we don't make a mistake in what we thought we saw and understood. But also there needs to be a amount of time, not 5 or 10 years, but an amount of time for it to sink in. You're going to give up your life for your act, and to have somebody witness to them. Like I said,
The Bible also says, I don't know if it's in the book of Judges, but one of the reasons why the land has so many problems is because they don't have swift judgment. Well, God doesn't want you to wait too long.
Yeah,
I understand what you're saying. It has to be done judiciously and with love and mercy. Because you want to save everybody who doesn't have an opportunity. Sometimes they need to be scared.
Yeah, that due process is so important. We're not talking about lynching people. It's not what we're talking about. Remember, going back to Romans 13, who is it that bears the sword? The government bears the sword, right? We're not talking about mob justice. We're not talking about street justice. We're talking about the duty of government is to punish evildoers and to reward those who do good. That is like the reason that government exists. And as Paul says, they do not bear the sword for no reason. And this is supposed to be a deterrent to do things that are worthy of death, because we can be put to death by the governing bodies which exist as the servants of God to carry out his justice on the earth. See, we oftentimes look at government as the enemy, but what the Apostle Paul tells us is that the government is a slave of God doing God's bidding on earth. setting up and executing God's justice on earth, on a societal level. That is the purpose and the role of government.
Of a good government.
Of a good government. Yes.
It also kind of implies we get the government we deserve. But then God looks at it, I keep going back to that, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and repent. So a lot of what happens, how much has happened to America because Christians have been told, oh, you don't need to be messy with politics, stay out of it and just preach Jesus. Which if we did a good job of preaching Jesus, we probably wouldn't have near as much trouble here in the world. But we gave up being salt and light. We said, oh, that's too messy. And how many of us have our own little sins that we don't want to repent of? How many pulpits in America are not telling people, hey, you cheated your neighbor. God's unhappy with that. So.
Yes, it's very true. In our last couple minutes here, I just want to say a few points. We're a little over, as is our custom here lately, but please just be gracious with me. I want to say one last thing. We're talking about the death penalty. Don't ever forget that Jesus submitted himself to the death penalty. I talked about this earlier on, but Jesus was put to death by the state for us. The only innocent man that has ever lived, the only righteous man that has ever lived, the only just man that has ever lived, voluntarily submitted himself to the death penalty so that our sins could be forgiven. And Pontius Pilate thought that it was him putting him to death. Pontius Pilate thought that he had the power to put Christ to death. But Jesus said, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down on my own accord. And on the cross, Jesus Christ suffered and bled and died in our place so that our sins could be forgiven. The punishment that I deserve for all of my lying and stealing and cheating and murder and adultery, Jesus paid the price for all of it so that I could be free. And anyone who puts their faith and trust in him, your sin was given to him, and his righteousness will be given to you. If you will trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, believe that Jesus Christ came and died and rose again for you, declare that he is Lord, and pursue after him, you will have the same righteousness that he had because he submitted himself to the death penalty for you. He took the punishment that you deserve in order that you could go free, in order that you could be made righteous in the sight of God. And so does God endorse the death penalty? I think he does. God used the death penalty to save humanity. And I just want to say, there are many who would say, well, you're pro-life, you don't want unborn babies to be aborted, but you're in favor of the death penalty. You're a hypocrite. How can you be pro-life over here but pro-death over here? And the answer to that question is you're talking about two different things. You're comparing apples to potatoes. It's not the same thing. These are two very different concepts. I am for protecting innocent life. I am also for punishing evildoers with the death penalty in a just way, in a way according to God's standards of righteousness, and etc., etc. But these are not the same thing. It is an act of love on both sides to protect the unborn, the innocent, the helpless, and to put to death people who are worthy of it and who have been justly convicted thereof. So you can make your political application from there. I think we all know which party is in favor of which of these things and which is against it. But as our last kind of political Bible study, I just want to say, if you go to vote wanting to declare, wanting to glorify God with your vote. I hope that all of this has been helpful. I hope that all of this has helped us to kind of look at the issues that we're facing from a biblical worldview and informed us. If this was helpful, I'd like to hear some feedback. And if not, if anyone have any questions or comments, go ahead.
I have a question. So, who's for what and what? I mean, like, I'm a felon, so I'm ready to vote. So I'm curious on like which side is for the death penalty. Trump.
I'll give you an example. I'll tell you a story to illustrate this. So the Democratic Party, the Democrats, which would be Harris, would be the presidential candidate. At the DNC, which is the Democratic National Convention, they had a big tent in the parking lot. And in that tent, in their parking lot, this was publicly advertised, they were offering free abortions to anybody who wanted them. in the tent at their DNC rally. And so they were literally sacrificing babies to the devil in the parking lot as they were doing their political stuff. Historically, Republicans have been the ones who are trying to fight against abortion. It was Donald Trump who installed Supreme Court judges who reversed Roe v. Wade, which made it able so states could make their own laws concerning abortion. So generally speaking, Republicans are opposed to abortion. Democrats love abortion. They celebrate abortion. They want everybody to have abortions. Abortions for everybody and for free, right? Not for free because we all have to pay for it. But that's kind of the general position. And also, generally speaking, Republicans would be in favor of the death penalty over and against Democrats. Democrats really aren't in favor of a justice system at all. They don't want judges. They don't want prosecutors. They don't want criminals. They don't want jails. They don't want any of that stuff. So, and Republicans are kind of different.
Go Republican.
Yeah, the Republicans seem to take the cake on this one.
Well, if we didn't have a crazy felon as the only candidate, I would say, yeah,
Yeah.
but
Well-
he's crazy.
Remember, we're not voting that we like this man and want to go have dinner for him. We're voting for what platform will he uphold in the office.
And the only felon that he's got is this makeshift
Oh, he's
legal
done
system.
other things that nobody
He's
knows
never been
about.
convicted
All
of.
right.
And with that being said, feel free to have this discussion a little bit later, but we are over, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Sister Bobby, will you close us in prayer this evening?